Welcome to the Gridwise Architecture Video Library. Today's presentation, California Energy Alliance, California's Energy Stakeholder Advocates, was presented on February 14, 2024 to the Gridwise Architecture Council. Josh Dean is the Executive Director of the Council. Welcome, Josh.
Perfect. All right. Welcome to the Gridwise Architecture Council, February 14th, 2024. Josh Dean, we appreciate you coming to present to us. You've been Executive Director at California Energy Alliance. If you want to give a little introduction of yourself and then continue with your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. And thanks everyone for allowing me to speak a little bit more about the California Energy Alliance. You mentioned my name is Josh Dean. I'm the Executive Director of the CEA. My background is kind of broad, from construction management through energy policy and work, and so that's kind of what drove me into green building work as well, but kind of drove me into the CEA. Started in late 2020, so perfect time to be working from home and still getting to meet a lot of our members as we're getting back into having some of these meetings in person. So happy to be here today to share a little bit more about what CEA does and a lot of our activities. We are predominantly focused on the building sector when it comes to energy, but I'm going to try to touch on what we're seeing with this move towards integrating buildings with the power and transportation sectors, and hopefully some good crossover. So I'll share a little bit more about us. What we're seeing from energy code and standards and policy, they're often kind of looked at as necessary factors that get in the way of executing projects. And so a few of us kind of realize that there's an essential nature to regulatory functions, and that is that policy drives markets. And so we've really seen that a lot in California for many decades, as energy policy has shown to be pretty effective in reducing energy consumption and creating space for innovation. And now we're seeing a wave of new energy and climate policy coming from the national level that is driving the advanced energy sector and pushing it to reach GHG emissions and reduction targets. So I wanted to kind of highlight a few themes that are listed here that CEA really takes an active role in a lot of the work that we do. And so that is, as I mentioned, sort of policies driving markets and pushing us towards integration, whether that's from within a building or between buildings and the grid or vehicles to grid, et cetera. Also looking at the various systems, meaning the building versus the grid versus transportation and everything within those kind of systems and how they've often been siloed, and what's needed to really integrate these various systems. And then finally, looking at building operations and maintenance and that skilled workforce that's really needed to help support this decarbonized economy and kind of transition to decarbonized buildings and grid and transportation sectors. So with a lot of this kind of being siloed as it is, CEA really tries to take a role in understanding different ways to kind of collaborate with different stakeholders to kind of bridge some of these gaps. And so that's where a lot of our work does focus. So how we kind of fit into these various topics, much of what we do is improving and evolving the energy code and standards. Here in California, predominantly, I'll get into a little bit of where we're looking to expand more to like ASHRAE and some other national type standards. But we are a leading advocacy organization for California's energy stakeholders. We were founded in 2016. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan alliance of business, government, environmental, and NGO leaders advocating for a healthy and equitable built environment that is powered by carbon-free, reliable energy sources. So where we really kind of play a role is providing a seat at the table for a lot of industry stakeholders and to be that conduit between policy and code makers and the market. And I'll share some examples of stuff that we've done and kind of how we're engaged in that and how we try to bring, our membership and the market's voice to provide a feedback loop to the policy and code makers. There's a quick snapshot of our current members. And again, we can't really, realize our mission without, this group. We do heavily rely on active engagement from our membership, and they do represent a wide range of energy stakeholders, from manufacturers to nonprofit organizations, research institutes, design professionals, consultants, and we kind of name it, trade groups, builders, and large end users. So we're constantly looking to diversify this group so that we have a broader voice and more collective, diverse voice whenever we bring about various proposals and code changes and policy updates and input And so we're always kind of actively looking to expand this to help, again, kind of broaden our voice and our expertise. And so with this diverse group, we really do function as that conduit between the regulatory agencies and California energy stakeholders. So we try to explain the regulatory process to the market, even though it's pretty complex and in depth, try to advise regulators on market realities. And a lot of our members and partners are actively engaged in this code making process and standards making process, and are really critical to successfully submitting some of the code change proposals. So as you can see from our initiatives, we got a kind of laundry list of things that we focus on and have been focusing on, whether it's codes and standards, evolution, looking at code compliance and enforcement, looking into some of the metrics that go into cost effectiveness tests for building energy code development and programs and incentive programs, looking at alternative kind of approaches to whole buildings and understanding some of the realities that are happening there with outcome-based codes or building performance standards, healthy existing buildings, and then again, doing sort of this education and outreach to share this knowledge back with the general public. So I won't dive into each of these too much because we actually, towards the end of last year and this year, are transitioning and kind of doing a strategic shift in our initiatives. And by the time I get through the end of this discussion, I'm going to just share, kind of why and how we've made a strategic change. And we'll really kind of package a lot of these together to focus on, kind of one main strategic objective. Just want to note and kind of add that CEA is relatively young, was founded in 2016 by a bunch of volunteers. I was the first person on payroll on staff, so that was late 2020 to try to transition to this day-to-day activities and really try to take CEA to the next level, because we have had such an impact over the years, even as like such a small organization, in that a lot of this work being focused on conducting the research and analysis for codes and standards. And so we have had this opportunity to work closely with the California Energy Commission on proposing code changes to the energy code. We've worked with utilities and the case teams on the code changes that they're proposing, and then developing some white papers and some research to back up some of these different ideas and different strategies that hopefully help sort of this decarbonization evolution. So I did want to just kind of, I think, lay a little bit out there as to what we track as CEA and how we try to engage both from a policy perspective and then diving into some of the codes and regulations and how we try to play a role and be a voice for our members. But, sort of seeing this change, it's coming from a new wave of energy and climate policy from a national level and what that looks like. There's a lot of new leadership from many other states. California's kind of been that beacon for a while, but I think really starting to see a shift in other states and national kind of activities that are really driving some of this change. And so briefly kind of touch on, what we're seeing from that and how it's being felt in California, but then also how CEA is playing a role in a lot of these discussions. So as I said, there's obviously a lot of new federal, state, local policies, a lot of funding coming out that's really driving some of this change and advancing the energy sector and really pushing the limits on greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. And so what we think, again, CEA is predominantly focused on the building sector. We're seeing this obviously becoming more integrated with the grid and vehicles. So this is creating a whole new world of metrics to really utilize for resilience and health and wellness, and even sort of energy costs and what that looks like for day-to-day usage. As we tack on storage and renewables, and how that may need to play an active role in what's occurring with the grid, and as the grid electrifies as well. So some key areas that there are definitely some policies that are impacting both the national and market here in California that we're tracking and heavily engaged in. Electrification, the heat pump market transformation, renewables and energy storage. What's happening with EVs and their infrastructure and how that plays a role with the built environment, flexible demand and load management standards. These are kind of key policies in California and what they see as kind of helping them decarbonize. The grid interactive efficient buildings. So as we kind of begin to integrate with what and how buildings actively integrate or actively are involved with the grid, these buildings need to be set up as kind of whole building systems and have a broader understanding of what that impact is and when and how they should be using energy. And then finally, things like building performance standards to kind of shift this focus to the existing building market and what that looks like for their ongoing energy performance, and hopefully help kind of improve those buildings over time. So I know that this is a group that's kind of across the US, so I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with California's policies. So there's a lot of kind of recent policy coming from the national level, like I said, but California's had many landmark bills and regulations that are really driving a lot of the decarbonization work, but also a lot of the work that CEA focuses on. And so some of that is also beginning to drive this integration of buildings with the grid and the transportation sectors. So, the AB 32 and SB 32 were, landmark bills to try to, discuss California's global warming solutions and, driving us towards these bigger targets of 2030 and 2040 type, GHG reductions below, certain year levels. There's other things like the SB 1477, which is really about funding heat pump technology, deployment, and streamlining some of the permitting and some of those kind of opportunities. SB 100, looking at trying to mandate 100% of all retail electricity sales to be provided by renewable energy and zero carbon resources by 2045. We've got doubling energy efficiency by 2030. There's the CEC having to establish standards to promote the addition of flexible demand technologies. And a lot of that then kind of comes into these agencies being tasked with kind of implementing these laws through new regulations and codes and standards to be developed to kind of help meet some of these targets that are in these types of bills. And so CEA's role has been to really track and understand what's coming so that we can share that with our stakeholders and help provide a voice and advocate for some of these changes and what that might look like in various codes and standards. And so knowing that this, we were founded as a lighting group that's really focused on the lighting sections of the energy code in California, have really expanded to try to encompass the whole building, what that entails, both from mechanical, electrical, lighting, the controls that are involved, how it now interacts with the grid. We have since sort of tried to take a step back to understand what is this decarbonization impact and where the gaps and opportunities might be and how we can begin to share some of these resources more broadly. So back in 2021, we did host a convening, and convenings are sort of a good example of some activities that CEA does where we bring together both the policy and code makers with the market and really try to help provide some feedback and input on what is and isn't working in some of the policies. And so with these convenings, we did focus on the three main sectors of buildings, transportation, and power to understand where there's an overlap, where there's some hurdles, where there's some gaps. And some of the big things that we found is that obviously this sort of active efficiency and load flexibility is going to be the next big kind of shift as we electrify and sort of decarbonize all these sectors, but also that those different agencies are still pretty much operating in silos, and they want to begin to hear what worked from the building sector and what the Energy Commission has done and with their incentive and rebate programs and how that might help with transportation or deployment of EV infrastructure. So it was a lot of good lessons that we've learned, and I think that we've tried to incorporate that into our focus now, that it's not just so specific into just the lighting portion of the code or the mechanical portion of the code, and that all of these things are kind of interrelated. And so really trying to drive that in a lot of the work that we do moving forward. So additionally, with that, we've like I said, we're trying to get out of the silo ourselves. So we trying to look to work with more of state agencies, but have predominantly worked and engaged with the California Energy Commission and much of their responsibilities that are kind of listed here, and that they're helping lead the state to 100% clean energy for all. But a lot of our focus has kind of been on number 3, that achieving energy efficiency, and that comes with energy efficiency standards for new buildings, existing buildings, and appliances. And again, I'm sure everyone here has heard or maybe even more involved in things like Title 24. But more precisely, the Part 6 of the Energy Code, or Part 6, which is the Energy Code, and then even diving further into what the CEC is developing is the Building Energy Efficiency Standards. So kind of with that, CEA's role is to not really only advocate for improvements, and so we present code change proposals, comments, and all that kind of stuff, but also to help explain some of this process to some other industry stakeholders and folks, across California, to kind of get more of those voices involved. Because I think that's sort of the hardest part, is to really understand when and how to get involved. And so with that, how to get involved, and what we try to provide is that, again, that sort of avenue for folks to have their voice heard. There's public participation through the Energy Commission and through their docket and submitting ideas and proposals and letters. But what we really do is provide code change proposals. So that's doing the research, doing the analysis to back it up. We work with other stakeholders, both our members and others, to provide and look into what's going on or what's been happening with the code and how to maybe simplify or clean up some of that language as it evolves, as the market evolves, kind of remove some things that are no longer relevant. And then also working with the investor-owned utilities and the case teams, which are funded by them, to help develop some of these other broader kind of code changes each code cycle. So we really try to get people involved, have this more kind of industry perspective on what's coming and how to make some of these changes. And the reason why we try to come together to do that is because it is a pretty complex way of how it works. And timing is everything when it comes to codes and standards development, as I'm sure many of you are aware of and probably work on other types of codes and standards work. But if you're familiar, Title 24 in the building code, it's on a 3-year cycle, but it really does feel more like a 4-year cycle in the sense that one of those years overlaps. So right now, we're waiting on this 45-day language from the CEC, which are the 45-day language, which is sort of this final draft almost of the building energy efficiency standards, which then get adopted and are then incorporated as Part 6 of the Energy Code. So as that happens right through here, kind of the last chance to really have any sort of say-so as to what's coming in the next Energy Code. And then from there, next year, they really are updating a lot of the software compliance models, all that sort of stuff to incorporate this. But the beginning of next year, CEA and other stakeholders are already working on developing proposals and ideas and research for the 2028 code cycle. So it's sort of a never-ending cycle of code changes. And we're already kind of discussing what maybe isn't getting involved in 2020, what's not getting incorporated in 2025, to see what we might want to look at for 2028. And some of that's, kind of into the weeds and sort of the nitty gritty. And this is just sort of another linear view of what it looks like for the code development and currently where we're at. But we've been involved in developing our own measures and with the case teams, as I mentioned, since fall of 2021 to look at this 2025 energy code updates that go into effect January 2026 once they are fully approved and adopted. And so, I mentioned and said that this is, this policy landscape is really changing, and it's not just in California. And California is kind of in that beacon, but I think we are starting to look at what's happening in other states and jurisdictions, how we can maybe incorporate that into our policy development and new code changes and all that kind of stuff. So, we're really looking at, what's happening in, say, New York with their local law 97, which is focused on kind of building performance standards, and how that big shift in discussion is really, occurring across the U.S. to put that focus on existing buildings. California just passed SB 48 last year, which is given the CEC some authority to develop a roadmap to look into a statewide building performance standard. It's going to take some time, and I'm sure a lot of pushback and input is needed to understand what that looks like. But there is huge movement afoot across the U.S. when it comes to these building performance standards, just because that seems like the best mechanism for trying to look into and improve existing buildings. And so we're kind of tracking that and talk about in just a little bit of what's really shifted some of our focus from just new construction, but also what's bridging this gap between a handoff of a new building to an existing building to ensure that it continues to operate and perform the way that it was intended. And so with that, we're getting more involved with organizations like ASHRAE, Institute for Market Transformation, PNNL, DOE, a lot of those folks that are leading some of this work across the US, so that we have a better understanding of what is and isn't occurring and happening, to help bring that back. Because I think Title 24 has always sort of been this leader when it comes to energy efficiency, but now kind of seeing this leapfrog back and forth between what ASHRAE 90.1 releases and IECC and some of these other, GHG decarbonization goals that states and jurisdictions have. And so it's a good lesson for us to learn what is coming and what's kind of happening. And because we can then also pull some of those that have been approved or that work well and bring that into some of the work that we're doing here in California. And so, kind of with that, like I said, a lot of this is just changing. I'm sure everyone here agrees and sees, with probably more so the grid and what's occurring, but want to kind of now talk about, where we're heading and what this looks like from sort of an integration perspective, and how CEA is kind of shifting our focus a little bit to one strategic objective. And so, as I mentioned, sort of the grid interactive, efficient buildings and a renewed focus on well-being of occupants in the spaces, we're kind of shifting our focus as to what metrics we may kind of care about and, where those impacts are. And so we kind of flew through this slide and through a lot of this. Again, it's trying to pack in a lot of stuff in, 20 minutes or so. But just want to kind of talk about, some of the topics as we're looking forward to the next code cycle, and how we're involved and where there may be further involvement with, other groups and coalitions and alliances that are focused on the grid or transportation, and how all of these things can kind of come together and provide a more cohesive and collective voice. So, some of the goals from these policies and what's happening, not necessarily just nationally, but in California, obviously, wanted to improve the energy policy, but incorporating, whole building practices, so that, it's back to this sort of system integration idea. And, HVAC systems are a critical piece of the puzzle, and many codes and regulations have really tried to squeeze as much as they can out of the energy efficiency out of lighting. And so, HVAC may be a bigger piece of the puzzle, but so are plug and process loads, which are typically left out of the, some of the energy codes and standards. And so trying to understand more whole building performance, so that, what does that impact on, sort of give and take for a decarbonized grid. And so that kind of helps support this, decarbonization, electrification efforts, and grid interactive efficient buildings. And, how are we going to get there? It's not necessarily through more regulations. The code's pretty complex, as it is here, and I'm sure it is in many other jurisdictions. And so with more complex codes and constant updates, it typically leads, and what we're seeing leads to more non-compliance. And so if the compliance drops and enforcement isn't there, then there's concern that building operations and sort of energy performance is going to decline. And so want to ensure that there is proper compliance and enforcement at that given time, so that we can, see these, the energy policies and the codes and standards actually have a true impact and help meet, the states and, other jurisdictions' GHG goals. And so, like I said, some of these potential changes that we're, looking into and trying to support and kind of move towards are around broader changes, and not necessarily just incremental code language changes, which we were focused on for so long, of, one word here or there, changing lighting power densities or something like that. It is trying to understand the much bigger impact that we can have through some broader changes. And so some of those are, monitoring more of the systems and doing sub-metering, so we know exactly where energy usage is going in the building to be able to make those shifts. And then, kind of helping manage when energy is being used. And as we see time of use rates and utility rates and all those kind of things changing, it's really going to play a factor into when and how to use energy as a building and sort of the end user, so that we have load flexibility, and that these buildings are smart and can actually maybe get back to the grid when needed, or, look at, vehicle to grid, vehicle to building kind of charging as well. So a lot of this, gets addressed in the energy code, but the CEC has to begin thinking about this more broadly, because as we talk about silos and kind of looking system to system, it's still sort of set up that way. And that's due to law and just sort of how the regulations are written for energy efficiency standards. But, the CEC for 2025 is looking at, some varying strategies to look at, all heat pump kind of baselines, promoting demand flexibility, covering those process loads, electric vehicle readiness support. We're already all electric kind of ready buildings right now, but really, and then also this sort of interagency coordination. So there's a lot here that they're trying to focus on, but I do think it's still missing from CEA perspective, some of this bridging the gap between new buildings to existing buildings and even sort of major alterations and additions that occur to building operations. So really trying to, give a little bit more authority to the CEC to understand what that looks like. And so hopefully, these buildings can play a better role in sort of being a good grid citizen. So kind of briefly touched on, the work that we do for the energy code for the 2025 code cycle. We were actively involved with a group of folks from SoCal Edison, RMS Energy Consulting, and California Lighting Technology Center to take a deep dive into all of the lighting and lighting control sections of the current code and try to simplify, remove language, remove outdated sort of strategies, and come up with a way to kind of clean up some of those sections. And so a lot of that was submitted, a lot of it's being incorporated into the code. So we do that kind of work. The multi-level lighting controls, mandatory monitoring, fault detection diagnostics, or various other proposals that we do our own research, cost effectiveness analysis, the energy modeling on the back end to try to propose these code changes. Similarly to how the statewide case teams do that. And so we do also get involved with them in trying to provide industry feedback and input on the changes that they're proposing as well. So we'll see, kind of what gets incorporated as that 45-day language does get released here soon. And then, like I said, we have been focused on the energy code and the energy commission, but really have to begin looking more broadly into what that means outside of and beyond the energy code. And so, and again, I'm sure that's similar to what's occurring across the US, but there are sort of additional codes and standards that are driving some changes and some integration, local reach codes, so local jurisdictions that are trying to go above and beyond what's in the code. Energy efficiency in existing buildings. I think the big topic of load flexibility and load management and how that can play a role for a future grid and for future buildings. We're also looking into CalGreen, which is the state's or California's green building code. Some of those measures are mandatory, or a lot of it's mandatory, but then there's some higher tiers, and we're trying to see how maybe we can get some more whole building approach to metering and maybe like fault detection type strategies into CalGreen so that it's then a pathway maybe to future codes. And then a lot of like policy and legislation action that's occurring, whether it's at the CPUC level, the Public Utilities Commission, or CARB, or Cal EPA, or CEC. A lot of this is, again, trying to understand what is the overlap and how to integrate, buildings and these decarbonization efforts. So kind of with that, we're also dipping our toes into some advocacy through legislation and becoming more of a voice and providing input and resources to state legislature and to their staff. Said SB 48 earlier, that's sort of that building performance standard model, but other things that we see kind of helping drive, and that's where we're really trying to get a little bit more active. So to kind of wrap this up, started out with all that whole laundry list of initiatives that we've had. And I think there's some core things here that we do and will continue to do, but strategically, we kind of see a few of these that are core to what we ultimately want to achieve in our work and hopefully want to see in buildings, and how to kind of bridge this gap between new and existing buildings and then ongoing building performance. And so not necessarily just energy performance, but understanding, the health and wellness of the occupants and what that might look like, and, its sort of interaction with the grid. And so we've taken this strategic approach to combine a lot of those previous efforts I just mentioned and look at outcome-based policies. Not sure if folks are familiar, but like what we look at is in terms of outcome-based codes or building performance standards. We're kind of putting under this umbrella of outcome-based policies, and that's really to kind of advocate for and implement outcome-based policies in California that prioritize measurable energy performance, promote human health, deliver environmental results, drive sustainable innovation, and achieve a decarbonized economy. So our goal is to really remove some of the barriers and roadblocks to maximize the efficiency, lower carbon emissions from buildings over the building's life cycle, while also maintaining health and life safety. And so, like I said, really hoping to begin to align some of what's coming from new construction energy codes and, maybe needing to shift how those codes are looked at so that we can bridge that gap with existing building performance. And we kind of hope, and see that outcome-based policies and this approach and what we would be advocating for really gets the state to its decarbonization goals, can begin to be a feedback loop to the CEC to understand how energy code updates are doing and how it compares to what is expected, because right now a lot of that is just based on deemed savings. There's really no kind of check in later on once the buildings are up and running to see how well they're doing compared to what was expected. So we want to begin to provide that feedback loop to ensure that the state's on its journey to meet its larger decarbonization goals. And so we'll have, a few of our working groups, like I mentioned, our government affairs and advocacy, codes and standards, compliance and enforcement, all there to help drive some of these ideas and principles to kind of help us hopefully see some further outcome-based policies. And I think that's already moving, with building performance standards and some of the focus in California and some of those, focuses that I showed that the CEC has. So always open to getting more folks to the table to collaborate, because we always need more insight and more, sort of support and expertise to discuss this, and always happy to engage and actively discuss this with other groups and groups like yours, and hope to kind of continue the dialogue in this discussion. But want to say thank you all again for letting me share a little bit more about CEA, and happy to answer any kind of questions.
Thank you, Josh. And for those who are interested in more information about the GridWise Architecture Council, please see our website at gridwiseac.org and subscribe to our YouTube channel at the link provided. Thank you.